30 seconds is a long time, isn't it? Now I want you to turn to somebody you're sitting next to and tell them what you thought. Why do you think this is an important topic? I'm going to give you about a minute. Make sure, let's do it in groups of twos so everybody can get their thought out, okay? 60 seconds. Okay, that was a minute. Now, okay, again, however you wanted to answer or think about that question, why is the topic of worship music and worship important? Or again, another way of asking the question specifically about you tonight, why did you come? What did you think you were going to hear, or what were you expecting and to hear? I'd like to actually see, I know this is not done a whole lot, but this is a seminar, okay? This is not the sermon. Sermon is just me downloading, or your preacher downloading, right? But let's do a little interaction. I'd like to see 3 hands of people who would tell what your partner, not what you said, so you got to have listened, what your partner said about why they think this topic of worship music is important. I want to see 3 hands. Nobody speaks until I've seen 3 hands. Thank you. Number 1, the preacher. Number 2, thank you. And number 3, good.
The preacher's wife said, God sings over us, therefore we're made in His image, so we ought to be singing.
Wow. In other words, the theological point that you're making here is that this has something to do with God's own nature. Wow, that's fantastic. Who was number 2? Who? Yes, Joseph.
Just to be able to explain the viewpoint to our sons and daughters, basically, is important. Why we do it this way.
Yeah.
And even for those that are in other churches, be able to express that.
Okay, excellent. The theological point I'm hearing you express is that this is something that is so much a part of us, but we may not actually know, or we may not be able to articulate all the reasons for it, and I want to be able to pass this down. I want to teach my children. I want to give them this gift as well. Excellent. And who was number 3? Yes.
Music is the window of the soul, and it is one of the ways that we can actively participate in service, in worship, not using just the cerebral part, but our emotions.
Oh, excellent. And what, again, the theological point I hear you saying is that when we sing, we are using, in some ways, at least, other parts of our being. Some part of our being that is not just the same as the intellectual. I mean, the intellectual can definitely be there and probably should be in some ways, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond to something deeper and transformative in a way that just words, just intellectual ideas might not. Boy, those are great reasons. Those are great reasons. I'll ask that maybe again at the end of the second lesson tomorrow. I'm not sure who all will be here tomorrow that's here tonight and who will be there tomorrow who's not here tonight. But it seems to me that you have hit on some of the most important theological reasons for why this topic is an important one to consider. Now let me say this. In my opinion, the topic of worship music, as important as it is and as significant as it is to us as Christians, as you've just expressed it, in my opinion, it's a 3rd level topic. In other words, this is not something that you would be talking about first or even second when you're talking about this whole business of worship. The first level is, what is worship anyway? What is it that we do when we are worshiping? And anyone who chooses to think about and to emphasize that topic of worship music, like what we're doing tonight, should spend a lot of time on that first primary topic. What is worship, period? We're not going to do that today and tomorrow because I've been asked specifically to talk about this topic. But what I'm simply saying is there's a whole lot that would go before this discussion about what worship is, period. And then the second level would be worship music, how we worship God with music. And the third level would be the instrumental or non-instrumental point. And so I'm thinking that even though this is important, it's not of the primary importance. Are you following me here? I'm not saying I don't really want to talk about this because it's very important, but it's not of first importance in my opinion. The other things are more important. But here we are, and we're going to be talking about instruments in worship, so let's start with that now. Here's what I'm going to do, okay? I am a church historian, and so we're going to do some history stuff. Now, I hope that you realized that before you came. Because at least before I got into my master's program, when I was in my late 20s, early 30s, if I had heard that there was going to be a history seminar at church on Friday night, I would not have been there. Because history was boring and irrelevant. Now, I know better than that now. But, I mean, all my history teachers in high school had been coaches, quite frankly, and they would say, read the chapter and answer the questions, and then we talked about the next ball game. Now, I have had people come up and say, boy, I had a very different experience. I had a brilliant, wonderful, inspiring history teacher when I was in high school. Well, blessings on you and blessings on them. I didn't. And in college, one of the godliest men I knew, an elder of the church, was my Western civilization teacher, 1 o'clock in lecture auditorium, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon. And I tell you, he was the boringest man on the face of the earth. He put me to sleep every afternoon. It's a bad time anyway. But my impression was, history is boring and irrelevant. And I know very differently now. Having a sense of our history, having a sense of how we have been shaped by the people and the ideas and the events that have come before us is part of our spiritual maturity, quite frankly. It's developing what I would call a spiritual historical consciousness. You know that you didn't just drop out of the heaven as you are. That you are the product of all sorts of people and events and ideas and habits and customs, many of which you may not even be aware of, but still powerfully shape you in your family, in your individual life, and in our churches, our congregations, and in the religious heritages that we're part of. And so what I want to do tonight is give us a little bit of a boost on some of this spiritual historical consciousness, specifically talking about the issue of instruments in worship. So the first piece I'm going to do is about the early church. The second piece I'm going to do is where instruments begin to be used in Christian worship. The third piece I'm going to do is to talk about the Protestant Reformation. And then the fourth piece is about our own movement, the movement that produced what we know as Churches of Christ today. And they're all connected. You may not see a connection at the beginning, but they all are connected. So let's start now with the early church. Early Christians did not use instruments in worship. That's just a historical fact. Nobody really disputes that at all. But there were two specific reasons that they did not use instruments in worship. The first is that they wanted to they had to at some point distinguish themselves from Jewish worship and from the Jewish religion. The first Christians were all Jewish. You know that. But as time goes on, and even in the New Testament there were predictions of this, and you see little hints of this even in the Gospels. But as time goes on, and by the end, especially the end of the first century, most synagogues were expelling Christians. They were kicking Christians out. They even had oaths that they made members of the synagogue take that would curse Christians and other groups that they believed were outside of their realm. And so especially as the church begins to be more and more non-Jewish, there was an effort to distinguish what they did, that is the Christians did, from what the Jews did. Now, in Jewish temple worship that existed until the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, there were instruments of music that were used. But as far as we can tell, in the synagogues, which would be like the scattered congregations all over the world as well as in Palestine, they did not. They chanted. They chanted certain words, many of them the Psalms. And the first Christian worship is very probably exactly that. They chanted the Psalms, just like they had done in synagogue worship. But as you began to see a sharp distinction made between Christians and Jews, Christian worship and Jewish worship, you have people like Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr was an early Christian leader, writes early in the 2nd century, okay? And he says this: simply singing is not agreeable to children. He's talking about the Jews. Simply singing is not agreeable to children. But singing with lifeless instruments and with dancing and clapping is. On this account, the use of this kind of instruments and of others agreeable to Jews is removed from the songs of the churches, and there is left nothing but simple singing. Now, this is a description of what the early church did. This is an early Christian writer who's describing Christian worship. And he says, we don't do it because the Jews do it, and they're children, and we've matured. One of the great early preachers of the church, great name. You'll learn some names tonight and some words probably. The guy's name was Chrysostom. Chrysostom. He was Greek. And if you translate Chrysostom into English, it would be golden mouth. Golden mouth. That meant he was a good preacher. Now, could you use that term here at Webb Chapel? Golden mouth. No. Okay, we're getting some affirmations here. Well, Chrysostom was one of the early Christian preachers and widely known. He's in actually the 3rd century, early 4th century. And so he says some similar things. He says, David had a lyre, the little stringed instrument like a little harp, with lifeless strings. The church has a lyre with living strings. Our tongues are the strings of the lyre with a different tone indeed, but much more in accordance with piety, with true worship, with true spirituality. And so you see that as the church begins to make its sharp distinction between itself and the Jewish worship, the Jewish religion, these early Christians began to use this kind of terminology. Now, instruments were used in pagan worship too. And in most cases, the pagan worship was connected with idol worship and with emperor worship. That is, the people of Rome would use these ceremonies and these worship services to worship the various Roman gods or even the emperor himself. And so another early Christian, end of 2nd century, says, leave the pipe to the men who are in fear of gods and intent on their idol worshiping. Such musical instruments must be excluded from our wingless feasts, for they're more suited for beasts. Instruments are more suited for beasts and for the class of men that is least capable of reason than for men. Okay. The early church did not use instrumental music in its worship. There were specific reasons that it did not. It wanted to distinguish itself from Jewish worship, and especially to distinguish itself from pagan worship, which did use instrumental music extensively. You can see in this carving, for example, the pipe that he's playing and the bull that is about to be sacrificed in one of the pagan rituals. So follow what I'm saying here. There are specific reasons why the early church did not use instrumental music that are unique to their time. Now, second, when did Christians begin to use instrumental music? The early Christians didn't, distinguishing themselves from the Jews and from the pagans. When that was no longer a reason, they were not having to distinguish themselves from Jews and pagans any longer, when did Christians begin to use instruments? Well, as far as we can tell historically, the earliest introduction into Christian worship of an organ was somewhere around the mid-600s. And it may have been that they played the organ as people came into the service. They didn't use it during the service itself. It didn't become very widespread at all for at least 3 more centuries. And so, you're talking about the 600s, 700s, 800s, 900s. In the 900s, it begins to be more and more widespread, adopted in the Western Church. Now, we're talking about Western Europe. Most people would call that the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Church did not use instruments. It's what we generally call the Orthodox churches. To this day, they don't, except for a very few. The Orthodox churches remain mostly a cappella today. Now, obviously, the Orthodox churches have a very different ritual, but Chrysostom sort of set that early on, and they go through the same kinds of worship order even today very often. But I'm reading from the orthodoxinfo.com website that you could go to if you wanted to. The Eastern Orthodox tradition bans instrumental music or accompaniment. The singing is always a cappella, with only a few exceptions admitted by westernized parishes in America. The idea behind the ban is based upon the practice of worship in the New Testament, that is, only the natural aptitudes, the voices, of the living congregation are viewed as capable of expressing praise that is worthy of God. Now, that's the Orthodox Church. Only the lyre, the voice given by God, the living streams, are capable of expressing praise worthy of God. And the Orthodox Church condemned the Catholic Church for adding instruments into their worship. But I suppose now, as we move to phase 3, the most relevant part of this story for us is the Protestant Reformation. Let me give you a little bit of a lesson about the Protestant Reformation, or the Reformation period. This only happens in Europe. It doesn't happen in the East, where the Orthodox churches are, and Christianity's spread to other parts of the world, like the Americas and so forth, hasn't really happened yet. But if you're thinking in terms of the West, you can look at it like my arm. Here we come through the years of the centuries, and it's the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And in early 1500s, there began to be these groups of people that break away or that change, who are saying there are things that we cannot keep on with. There are things that we think must be reformed. That's the reason it's called the Reformation. The first one is Martin Luther. The second part of the Reformation is called the Reformed. Now you may say, what do you mean? Reformed Reformation? Well, they just call themselves the Reformed movement. That's John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, people like that. Then you have the Church of England, the Anglican Church. In America, it would be called later the Episcopal Church. And then you have the Anabaptists, the radicals, the folks who broke away from the whole idea of church-state connection and therefore stopped baptizing their infants. And then, I've got 5 fingers here. So you've got the Lutherans, the Reformed, the Anglican or Church of England folks, and the Anabaptists. What's that middle piece? It's the Catholics. The Catholics went through a major Reformation during that era as well. Had a major council, the Council of Trent, that said there are abuses that have got to be stopped, and they began to change a lot of the things that had been protested. But it was already underway. It couldn't be called back, and there were these major initial streams of the Protestant Reformation. Now, Martin Luther believed that if a practice was beneficial to the spiritual life of the people of the church and was not specifically condemned in the Scripture, then it could be used. All right? This is a difference in the way people understood the silence of Scripture. If the Scriptures don't say anything one way or the other about something, can you use it or not? Martin Luther said, well, you don't just do anything that the Scriptures don't specifically condemn, but if it is deemed to be spiritually beneficial to the people, to the church, to whatever task the church is given to do, like evangelism, then you can. You may use those things if they're not specifically condemned by Scripture. John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, the second part of the Reformation, that Reformed part of the Reformation, they took the other position. They took the other position. If the Bible doesn't say do it, you can't do it. If it's not specifically commanded, it is therefore prohibited. All right? And so, I'll just put those guys' pictures up. There's John Calvin on the left and Ulrich Zwingli on the right. John Calvin says some interesting things. Now, okay, keep in mind what they're saying about worship and worship music has a context. All right? It's the Protestant Reformation. Now, other than that Catholic Reformation that I referred to is sort of the third finger of my hand in this illustration, all the rest of these folks hate Catholics. And anything the Catholics do is bad. Right? I mean, we all inherited that in America, that anti-Catholicism was brought over by our Protestant forebears into this country. I have a friend who teaches at Fordham University. He's a Roman Catholic. He wrote a book about 2 years ago. The title of the book was Anti-Catholicism, the Last Acceptable American Prejudice. Well, I don't know if he's totally correct on that. There may be other acceptable prejudices too. But as a Catholic, he got a lot of that kind of thing. And so these folks, in the context that they're speaking from, they are criticizing the Catholics, just like the early church was criticizing the pagans and the Jews. All right? And so John Calvin says, John Calvin wrote and wrote and wrote. Martin Luther writes a lot too. John Calvin is more organized than Martin Luther, and you can find his stuff a whole lot easier. John Calvin says in his comments, in his commentary on Psalms, the worship of God, in fact, I think I've got part of this on this next slide. The worship of God was never understood to consist in such outward services, which were only necessary to help for such outward services. He's talking about using instruments, which were only necessary to help forward a people as yet weak and rude in knowledge and in the spiritual worship of God. He's talking about the Jews. He's reflecting some of those early Christian arguments. Now that Christ has appeared and the church has reached full age, if it were only to bury, it would be only to bury the light of the gospel should we introduce the shadows of a departed dispensation. So, in his way of reflecting the attitudes of the early Christians, arguments against the Jews, they're still weak, they're still children, they're still rude in their knowledge and spiritual worship of God. As Christ has appeared, we don't need to go back to those shadows. And then he says this, musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting up of lamps, and the restoration of other shadows of the law. The papists, you ever heard that term? The papists. You can think of a lot of terms for people that you label people, bad words that you call people. I mean, we've got plenty of them in America too, but this was a big word for the Protestants. The papists, the Roman Catholics, therefore have foolishly borrowed this, as well as many other things from the Jews. Men who are fond of outward pomp may delight in that noise, but the simplicity which God recommends to us by the apostle is far more pleasing to him. And so what you see in John Calvin's rhetoric in these two passages, he reflects those early Christian attitudes, arguments against Jews and pagans, and then his strong anti-Catholicism. All right. Now, I wanted to sort of show you that Reformation diagram because this piece, this Reformed piece with Calvin and Zwingli, is very important for us. The Reformed folks, sometimes they're just called Calvinists, okay? Zwingli he died young and he didn't write as much, and his stuff didn't get translated into English and so forth like Calvin's did, so he's not as much remembered. But he's very powerful in his understanding of that restricted view of the silence of Scripture as well. But the Reformed part of the Reformation, that's where we came from historically. The three major groups of Reformed folks, as things began to develop, Calvinists, were Presbyterians and Baptists and Congregationalists. Those were the three major Reformed groups as far as actual groups that began to take shape. All right? Presbyterians, Baptists, and Congregationalists. We could go into a lot of material with that as well. All of the early leaders of the movement, we now call it the Stone Campbell movement, sometimes called the Restoration movement, all of the early leaders of the movement that would bring about what would be today the contemporary churches of Christ were Presbyterians. And many, many people came from Baptist backgrounds into that early movement, that Stone Campbell movement or that Restoration movement. And so we were very powerfully influenced by these ideas. And here's the interesting thing. All of those groups had controversies over instrumental music, just like us. Now, I think I'm right in this. I think that churches of Christ, that is, a cappella churches of Christ that primarily have their roots in specific American context most recently, I think that Churches of Christ is the largest group of people who worship a cappella other than the Orthodox Church. Now, there are others that do, plenty. There are a number of Anabaptist groups, Mennonites, who are a cappella in their worship. There are quite a number of, well, let me just talk about a couple of these folks. This guy, Robert Dabney, was a Presbyterian, and the Presbyterians, I mean, that's John Calvin's folks. In America, the Presbyterians had a roughly the same time that we were having a controversy in our movement in the 1800s and early 1900s, had a big controversy over whether or not instrumental music was legitimate. And Dabney was leading the charge against the idea of introducing instruments into Presbyterian worship. And there was a split in the Presbyterian Church. There have been a number of splits in the Presbyterian Church. I sometimes say that because all of our early leaders were Presbyterian, we inherited the divisive gene from them, because the Presbyterians in the history of Christianity probably have split more than anybody else. We come close, but they've done pretty much too. And there's a split in the Presbyterian Church, and there is a Presbyterian denomination today called the Orthodox Presbyterians who are a cappella in their worship. They sing basically psalms. There's an Orthodox Presbyterian congregation on Buffalo Gap Road in Abilene, and they are a cappella in their worship. The Baptists also had a big controversy over whether or not instruments should be introduced into the worship. This man was the leader in the Baptist movement, David Benedict. He writes a book, 50 Years Among the Baptists, and he says in this book, this is 1860, staunch old Baptists would as soon have tolerated the Pope of Rome in their pulpits as an organ in their galleries. Now you hear that strong sense of Protestant anti-Catholicism. He's reflecting the same kind of things that he would have heard when he went to school, when he went to seminary, and when he read John Calvin. And yet the instrument has gradually found its way among them, he says. Now, the Baptists split in a number of ways over a number of different issues, but the one group that continues to be a cappella is the Primitive Baptists, sometimes known as the Hard Shell Baptists. They're Calvinist, they're a cappella in their worship. I remember one Sunday morning when I was living in Nashville, I always listened to WSM radio on Sunday mornings because they had religious programming, and I don't know, I just listened to the religious programming. And so one morning I turned it on, and there was an a cappella singing of A Wonderful Savior is Jesus My Lord. And I thought, oh, I didn't realize Herald of Truth had a program on WSM on Sunday mornings. And then after the song was over, it said, this is Elder LaSayer Bradley of the Primitive Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I thought, wait a minute, that's our song. You can't be singing that song. But they are an a cappella tradition, and there are quite a number of them. Now, let me say something about our own movement then. Like I said a few minutes ago, all of the people in our movement who were the early leaders were Presbyterian. Thomas and Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, Walter Scott, all had been shaped in Presbyterian contexts, either in the United States or in the old country, Ireland, Church of Scotland and Ireland. But, and so they were shaped by those same sets of ideas that you saw in these other Reformed people. And so when the issue began to come up, roughly the same time it does among the Presbyterians and the Baptists, as the issue begins to come up in our context in Churches of Christ or in the Stone Campbell movement, the same kinds of reactions began to take place. Alexander Campbell was asked. There were some articles that began to appear in Alexander Campbell's newspaper, the Millennial Harbinger. And this one from, what does it say, 1851. There had been some articles, some people saying, yes, it's good, some people saying, no, we ought not to do it, using some of the arguments that had been very typical of the Reformed anti-instrumental position. And Alexander Campbell himself says, you know, to those who have no real devotion or spirituality in them and whose animal nature flags under the oppression of church service, I think that instrumental music would be an essential prerequisite to fire up their souls, to even animal devotion. I mean, people can't sit in church without going to sleep. He's just tired of it. And if, you know, these kind of people, if they had to, I guess it'd be fine. They need it. But to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert. And that was Campbell's opinion. And like I said, there were articles that were written back and forth. Not good, good, okay, no, we can't do it, back and forth. But here's the important piece. While there were differences, and while there were people, some congregations, not very many at first by any means, but some congregations that did begin to use instruments in their worship service, it was not made an issue of fellowship. At first. But it would become an absolute marker of faithfulness to God eventually. My contention, having studied this for a number of years and thought about it for a long time, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying this weekend, I believe that, and I'll read some things tomorrow afternoon that will sort of reinforce this. The a cappella worship tradition is one of the most brilliant, amazing, theologically transformative traditions in all of Christianity, okay? Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. But I do not believe that we must denounce and condemn those who use instruments in worship as somehow in open rebellion to God. Now, I want to talk about how that happened. Alexander Campbell, as you can see, again, personally did not believe that this was something that ought to be included in worship. He says it's okay for people who are not spiritually minded, I suppose, but for spiritually minded Christians, it's just not appropriate at all. It would be as jarring as a cowbell in a concert. And I suppose that, well, let me just take a minute. Okay? I'm going to get you to do something to get your blood circulating again. Turn to your neighbor. I don't know. A lot of you are sitting with your spouses, and that's wonderful. I would be sitting with my spouse right now if I were not standing up here. But if you could turn to somebody who's not your spouse, they probably already know a lot of your thinking and so forth. Turn to somebody else and just say, what is one point I've gotten so far in what's been said tonight? Now, a point that you think is relevant, a point that you maybe disagree with something I've said, whatever it is, turn to your neighbor, 60 seconds. What is one thing that you've gotten so far from what we've talked about? All right. Too much laughter down here on the front left. Let me see the hands of 3 people who have not yet spoken in the whole group about what one point you heard from your talking partner. 3 hands. Thank you, number 1. Thank you, number 2. Need one more hand. Thank you, number 3. Number 1.
That we shouldn't criticize the other type of churches.
Okay, that there are, what you've heard at least partly is that there are different ways of seeing this understanding of instruments in worship, and that these folks that we've seen so far have had very specific reasons for criticizing, but we need to understand what those reasons were. Yeah. Okay, all right. Who was number 2? Yes.
I didn't hear one single "thou shalt not." The Baptists say the same songs that we do. Are they any more reverent to God, singing when they've got a piano backing them up than we are singing a cappella?
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Christian worship music has been shared across the board for centuries. I mean, now I'll have to admit, every group has some of its pet songs, right? I mean, everybody in Churches of Christ at one point at least knew 728B. People would say, what are you talking about, 728B? You don't even use the songbook that has 728B, but you knew what 728B was. Our God, He is alive. But we share 90%, especially with groups like Baptists and sometimes with Presbyterians and others that we share so much heritage with. Absolutely. And so you begin to say, okay, what's going on here? And number 3.
I think that your description of the placement of that subject of instrumental music coming down the line, lower, if you will, priority, tells me with fellow brothers and sisters who are believers in Jesus Christ that because they happen to use instrumental music, we do not have a salvation issue going on here. It's not that we can be judgmental about that because of a salvation issue of instrumentals or not instrumental music.
Okay, I think that is an implication that you have made from the things that we've talked about so far. Here are the lessons that I would have said. And I didn't want to play guess what I'm thinking. I do that sometimes with my students. That's an awful game to play because they'll never guess. So I didn't want to play that with you. But these are the lessons that I would have said. I think you've said pretty much what I would have said in slightly different words. Number one, this has been an issue throughout Christian history. It's not new. We're not just some kind of nuts. Okay? This is not a new issue. This is something that Christians have thought about and struggled over and tried to figure out what is God's will on this. Number two, the reasons Christians have opposed or supported instrumental music in worship have always had specific contexts. Do you know what I mean by that? The early church wanted to distinguish itself from pagans, and they didn't want people mistaking them for, just one more pagan group, or even the Jews. And so they said, we will not use it. That's a specific context, so we're not in that context. The Reformation folks, for the most part, especially the Reformed folks and the Anabaptist folks, said, we don't want to be like the papists, so we're not going to use it. They always had specific context. And then thirdly, again, I guess this is kind of an implication, historical precedents alone, while not irrelevant, does not make the case for the use or non-use of instruments in worship. In other words, I have heard people write books, I've read materials that people have written, and I've heard people make presentations, and they'll use the material that I used at the very beginning of this lesson about the early church not using them, and the arguments that the early church used, and that then is used to interpret certain scriptures in certain kinds of ways. The New Testament itself says zero about instruments except in Revelation. Again, that has to do with the silence and how you view the silence of Scripture. And we've generally, with that strong Reformed sense, said the silence restricts. All right, I know you're getting tired. I know you want to go home. I want to go home. I'm tired. Now, we've had our 3-year-old grandson for the last week. Now, you talk about being tired. I tell you, 3-year-olds they do not stop. They just don't stop, and you can't let them by themselves for a minute. We took him to the zoo, and we'd see one animal for 2 seconds. He'd say, I want to see another animal. He'd go on. I said to my wife, this child has the attention span of a 3-year-old. That's not you. You're still staying with me. But I want to at least start tonight, and we'll finish if we need to tomorrow, how this thing became a red flag issue for us in churches of Christ. How did it become the marker of whether or not you were faithful to Christ or not? And it did for many of us. Well, of course, you see the article by Campbell. He personally thought it was not right, and his wife, Selena, after he died, also believed that it was not right and sort of took up that mantle. But I have to be frank with you. I believe that a lot of what made the shift happen has to do with the Civil War. Before the Civil War, there were differences. There were some folks who said it's not right, it's not appropriate. Campbell would have said that. Others said we think that it is right in the context that we're in to, I think in many cases, be attractional, to worship in the way that we feel like we want to and need to. Somebody talked about music being sort of the heart language of a people. But there had not been anybody pointing their finger and saying, because you put a melodeon in your church, you're no longer a Christian and we cannot have any fellowship with you. Nobody was saying that. And I'm going to make a long story short. I know you want me to. The Civil War was physically fought in the South. There were only 2 major battles outside of the South, Antietam and Gettysburg. And they were in the lower part of the North. and it was just a sort of an incursion and came right back. The South was devastated. The infrastructure was destroyed. The farmland was completely wiped out. Cities and towns and what little industry that there was gone. Hundreds of thousands of people, combatants and non-combatants, were dead. And thousands of able-bodied people moved out of the main theater where the war had been fought, along the Mississippi and Virginia and all of those places in between. Literally, people were starving to death after the Civil War. Now, it always happens in any war, Some of you were involved perhaps in World War II or the Vietnam War or the Korean War. My father he was drafted in the World War II, had to come home early because of his father running a farm that was considered to be of national worth, and his father had been injured. He didn't serve long enough to fulfill his draft time, and so he was drafted again for the Korean War. Some of you have had experience with war, but you know wherever a war is actually fought, it's devastated. But the parties that are involved in the war, where the war is not physically fought, now there are terrible things that happen, people die, and I'm not saying that there weren't terrible things that happened, but the areas where the war is not physically fought prosper economically. People are making money. Employment goes down to almost zero or completely to zero. And you can't spend the money on consumer goods because the entire economy is geared toward the war effort. My dad talked about you couldn't buy gasoline. You had to have coupons. And you couldn't buy gasoline just to go on a trip somewhere because the gasoline was being used in the war effort during World War II. And so people were earning money, they were making money, they were working, but they didn't have it to spend. They didn't have anything to spend the money on because the consumer economy had been completely redirected. Now, when the war was over, then, for example, in World War II, when the war was over, all that money begins to be spent on consumer goods. The economy retools from jeeps and bullets and tires for the big vehicles, tanks, to refrigerators and stoves. And churches began building new buildings. West End Church of Christ in Nashville, and right after the war, builds one of the first church build, maybe the first church building of Churches of Christ in Nashville, with a steeple. Condemned by all the other churches for wasting money. Yeah. In the South, after the Civil War, people are starving to death. In the North, the economy redirects. People have money to spend. Confederate money is worthless in the South. And churches begin to build new church buildings. And many of them began to put instruments in the church building. They wanted those things. And again, I'm making a long story short, but many of the people in the South are looking at this and they are saying, how can you possibly be Christians when we are down here destitute, literally in some places starving to death, and you're spending hundreds, thousands of dollars on new church buildings and on organs? You can't be Christians. That has to be contrary to the will of God. Now again, there had been theological arguments before the Civil War for and against instruments. But when they began to see, many of those in the South began to see the northern churches building new buildings and putting in instruments while they are in terrible, destitute conditions. How can that be right? How can that be good? How can that be Christian? How can you be our brothers and sisters? The same thing happened in a slightly different way with organizations like the Missionary Society. We could talk about that at another time. So you begin to see in that period of 30, 40 years between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century, you see a shift taking place. Now, the economic piece gets forgotten. The economic piece gets forgotten, and it's just Bible. We're just going by the Bible. You can't use instruments because the Bible does not authorize them. The economic piece gets forgotten. This guy was one of the chief ones who helped sort of shift this to an identity issue, a red flag issue, a faithfulness issue. This is Moses Laird. Now, it looks like Lard, I know. But the family that continues to live in Nashville says, no, we're Scottish, it's pronounced Laird. Okay? It's kind of like the woman on PBS, what is her name? Bucket. But she says, no, it's not Bucket, it's Bouquet. But anyway, Moses Laird was a very influential editor and preacher in Churches of Christ, and he published what's called Laird's Quarterly, and talked about, he didn't think that the movement could possibly divide. It's an interesting set of ideas that he puts on here. But the piece that is most important for Moses Laird and the division and the making of instrumental music specifically as an issue that is wrong and therefore disqualifies someone from being even considered to be a Christian is an event that took place in August 1889. Now, the churches in Illinois, Indiana, several of those states and counties in that central part of the United States, Midwest part of the United States, had been having this encampment every year. I don't know, have any of you ever been to the Yosemite encampment, or there's one in New Mexico, Red River encampment, and where Christians would just come together and camp out, and they'd have worship services at night and maybe some classes, but do recreational things. The churches in that area, in that part of the country, had been doing that for years at a place called Sand Creek, Illinois. Sand Creek, Illinois. Now, Moses Laird was very much opposed to what he saw as the innovations, that is, instrumental music, missionary societies, paid, located preachers, and several other things. And he got a number of people, elders of various churches in that area, to sign a document that he wrote called the Address and Declaration. Now, we didn't have time to talk about Thomas Campbell's 1809 Declaration and Address. Thomas Campbell in 1809 wrote a document called the Declaration and Address calling for the unity of all Christians. Well, Moses Laird in 1889, 80 years later, writes this Address and Declaration at Sand Creek, and it's not a unity document, just the opposite. He writes the document, he gets one of the elders of one of the congregations there to actually read the document, and he lists all of these things. He says, back in the good old days, we didn't do any of this, and everything was going great, and now some people are trying to pull these things in, and he says, there are among us, let me see, I think I've got part of this. Well, let me just go ahead and, I'm not going to do that slide. I'm just going to go ahead. This is from his article, Can We Divide? That's not what I was going to do just now, but he talks about if 50 of our churches were to combine to produce a creed or to introduce organs or to encourage dancing. He had a big thing against dancing. He writes a whole article about dancing in church, and I don't know anybody in those days that was dancing in church, but I don't know, he really was afraid of that coming in. As far as the 3 points named are doctrinal, they're clearly heretical. Hence, the churches so combining and so determining would fall certainly under the condemnation of the Scriptures and would have to be rejected. Now, he said that's not a division in the church, that's a departure from the church. Church is still united. These folks are not part of the church. That's his reasoning in that Can We Divide article. But he says in the Sand Creek Address and Declaration, let me just back up to his, I'm sorry, that's Moses Laird. The next guy is Daniel Sommer is the one. I'm sorry, I'm jumping guns all over the place tonight. Daniel Sommer, great beard. He's the one who actually is behind the Address and Declaration of 1889. And in that he says, This is the end of it on the screen right now. There are among us those who teach and practice things not taught or found in the New Testament, which have been received by many well-meaning disciples, but rejected by those more thoughtful. Okay. There's a touch of arrogance there. And in most cases better informed in the Scriptures, and who have repeatedly protested against this false teaching and those corrupt practices among the disciples. Some of the things of which we hereby complain and against which we protest: the use of instrumental music in the worship, the select choir, to the virtual if not real abandonment of congregational singing, and then he lists 3 or 4 others. He says at the end of the address, as is being read by one of the elders there, "We're impelled from a sense of duty to say that all such as are guilty of teaching or allowing and practicing the many innovations and corruptions to which we have referred, after having had sufficient time for meditation and reflection, if they will not turn away from such abominations, we cannot and will not regard them as brethren." That's the Sand Creek Address and Declaration, August 1889. Some people would say that's where the division took place. Well, it's hard to say when the division took place because we're congregational. And every local congregation has to make its decision about what it's going to do or not, how it's going to go, how it's going to align itself. There's no headquarters that sends out a memo that says we're now separated from these congregations or these folks who do this or that. And that division worked its way painfully through every local congregation over decades. And the instrumental music issue was one of, if not the most inflammatory of the issues that caused those divisions. I mean, you can support, I guess, in your heart the missionary society and be sitting next to someone on a Sunday morning and you're not punching them in the ribs every 2 minutes saying, "I support the missionary society, I support the missionary society." But if there's an organ up front or playing in the back, it's there. You can't get away from it. And so it became, because of those attitudes that became so hardened with Moses Lard, with Daniel Sommer, and the Address and Declaration of 1889, they became so powerfully shaping in article after article in papers like the Gospel Advocate in Nashville and the Firm Foundation in Texas. David Lipscomb, who for a long time refused to make it an issue of division, got so frustrated with the attitudes on both sides. He said at one point, he said, "I'm tone deaf anyway, it doesn't make any difference to me." But eventually, because of the hateful, divisive attitudes, he came out on the side of the non-instrumentalists. And he appropriates all of that rhetoric, that powerful rhetoric. Listen to what he says in an article in 1901. This is David Lipscomb in 1901. "The use of instrumental music in connection with the worship of God, whether used as a part of the worship or as an attractive accompaniment, is unauthorized by God and violates the oft-repeated prohibition to add nothing to, take nothing from the commandments of the Lord. It destroys the difference between the clean and the unclean, the holy and the unholy. It counts the blood of the Son of God unclean and tramples underfoot the authority of the Son of God." To use instruments is to profane the blood of Christ. It's the rhetoric of unfaithfulness. I admire David Lipscomb in many ways, but he was pushed to the limit by the people who had attitudes really on both sides, but the folks on those who favored instrumental music that had contact with him, I don't know. Lipscomb came across very abrupt. If you were to go back and read some of David Lipscomb's articles in the Gospel Advocate back in the 1880s and 90s and early 1900s, he would seem like a very abrupt person. But apparently he was just writing the way he knew how to write. He was not very brilliantly articulate or anything. He was just a simple, godly man, quite frankly. I think he's wrong here, but he was simply... Isaac Arrett, who was David Lipscomb's editor of the Gospel Advocate. Isaac Errett, who we'll see tomorrow, was the editor of the Christian Standard, the Christian church paper. That was the group that did, for the most part, accept instrumental music. And they were at each other all the time in their articles. Well, David Lipscomb had some kind of a condition, and he went to Cincinnati, where the Christian Standard is published to this day in Cincinnati, Ohio. He went to Cincinnati to take some kind of treatment, some kind of water treatment. I don't know what it was. People used to go to hot springs, to sit in the baths and that kind of stuff. It's something like that. He went to Cincinnati to take some kind of treatment. Well, he couldn't miss the opportunity to go by and visit Brother Errett. They've been exchanging these articles. They've never met each other face to face. And so David Lipscomb goes to the Christian Standard office, knocks on the door, says, I want to see Brother Errett. And whoever it was that received him went and told Brother Errett, David Lipscomb from Nashville is here to see you. I don't know what Errett thought. This was totally unannounced. I think he probably thought some old crotchety man was going to come in and whack him with his cane or something. But Errett writes about it later on. He said he was one of the most humble, godly men I've ever met in my life. But the fights got so bitter and so full of hate that even a man like David Lipscomb could be pushed to write something like this. That rhetoric of unfaithfulness. And then we had debates. I've got a list of them here. Not every single one of them, but they go from 1908 right up to 2007. Between people within this movement over instrumental music, whether it's authorized, whether it's condemned, whether it's something that should be allowed, freedom on that. And then I'll talk more about this tomorrow because we're going to close now. There was a powerful idea that began to be set forth by a couple of men, Whiteside and Nichols, C.R. Nichol and R.L. Whiteside, two Texas preachers. Has anybody ever seen these books before? There were 5 volumes, Sound Doctrine. They were used in the churches of Christ as Sunday school literature. The chapters are just real short, have questions at the end. They were used extensively. And what they put forth as a basic premise in this book is what's called the positive law idea. And basically what they say is that if you obey a command because it makes sense and you can see why God would want you to do that, then that's not really faithfulness at all. Faithfulness is when you can see no logical connection. I'll just read what they say. We can see a reason for many things God commands, and while we must in such cases comply, that's no test of loyalty. In a test of faith or loyalty, there must be no apparent connection between the act commanded and the result promised, and there should be no outside circumstances or surroundings impelling us. The command must be such that the moving cause is our reverence for God and our devotion to Him. Now, I think the moving cause of anything we do should be our reverence for God and our devotion to Him. I'm not disagreeing with that. And I'm not believing that we have to understand why on everything that God says to do. But when you separate, like what they did, the reason why God tells us to do certain things, the point of why we are what we are, the point of what Christianity is all about, it can become cultic and very dangerous. You don't question anything, you just do exactly what it says. Well, obviously what you're doing is what somebody tells you it says, or what you convince yourself it must say. And all of the things that we've talked about so far, and a lot more, are part of that convincing people of what it must say. That's what they said. That's the introduction. Tomorrow we'll continue and talk about how churches of Christ are dealing with it today, because there is change and there's some things that have been fairly controversial. If you still have any energy whatsoever and have a couple of questions, I will entertain one or two, but I'm sure some people are saying, I hope nobody has a question. It's 8:45 and time to go home. One or two, yes.
Would you explain to an Okie what you mean or what you think pagan worship is? And is it possible that it could still exist today?
Well, okay, the word pagan, first of all, is simply from the Latin word pagani, which means country people. Now, the reason, okay, this was actually appropriated by the Christians to say those people who still worship the old gods, who have not yet become Christians. And Christianity in the early centuries was primarily in the cities, and therefore most of the people who remained pagan, not all, but most of the people who were pagan were still living out in the country areas, the pagani, all right? They were the people who had not come into Christianity, who were not worshiping the true God. Yes, obviously, it's possible today to have some kind of worship that would not be worshiping the true God. Now, how you define that would be depending on what your premise is and what your agenda is.
This may be one of the questions you won't answer.
Okay.
Is there a point, or do you perceive a point in a worship service where the use of instrumentation or choirs or orchestras quits being worship and becomes entertainment?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, because I want to talk about this whole business again a little bit about that first level question of what worship is. Because a lot of times people have made arguments for doing this or that in a way that I would call attractional. We want to attract more people to our church building, our worship service. If we can get them in, they can hear the gospel and be converted or whatever. I think there are real dangers with that. I think there's some real dangers with that. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow. I'm also going to talk about some more about what Isaac Errett, the guy that we talked about, the editor of the Christian Standard, said that I think is very helpful in the context of that first division that was beginning to heat up so hotly and angrily, that caused that division that instrumental music was very much at the top of. So why don't we save that one for tomorrow, and why don't we close with prayer? Yes, one more question?
Would you do me a favor, and tomorrow would you repeat the questions for people like myself who are arguing?
I'm sorry, yes, the question actually was, is there a point where adding all of these things, instrumentation, choirs, etc., becomes not worship but entertainment? That was the question. And I would say that there's a real danger. I'm not sure that I can say it's inherently always that by any means, but I'm thinking that there's a real danger. And I think if some people say, yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to add this for these reasons, I think you really have to dig deep down and say, what is the reason that we want to change? And I want to talk a lot about that tomorrow. All right, 4:30? 4:30? 4:30. Should we end with prayer? Can I end with prayer? Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for loving us and giving us everything good. Thank you for your church. Thank you that we can come before you and worship, to adore you and praise you and to build one another up. We pray you'll be with us the rest of this evening, that you'll give us a good night's rest and bring us back together tomorrow as we continue thinking about this topic and as we engage in a wonderful time of singing praise to you and building one another up tomorrow. In Christ's name, amen.